This is the story of a woman who drowned Paris in Protestant blood, only to drown herself in the fluids of her own diseased lungs. In the winter of 1589, Catherine de' Medici lay dying in the Château de Blois, her chest rattling with each labored breath as pleurisy filled her airways with the very liquid that would become her executioner. The most powerful woman in 16th-century Europe, the architect of the most brutal religious massacre in French history, gasped for air like a common criminal at the gallows, abandoned by allies and treated by her contemporaries with no more consideration than a dead goat. Her final weeks were consumed by a singular, terrible irony. She who had orchestrated the drowning of thousands in the River Seine now found herself drowning in the corruption of her own flesh, a grotesque parody of the watery grave she had filled 17 years earlier. The woman who would become known as the Serpent Queen entered this world as an orphan, abandoned by fortune before she could even comprehend its meaning. Born Caterina Maria Romula de Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence on April 13, 1519, she was thrust into existence during one of the most tumultuous periods in European history, when the Protestant Reformation was fracturing the very foundations of Christendom and the Italian wars were reshaping the political landscape of the continent. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, died of syphilis when she was barely a month old, and her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, succumbed to puerperal fever just 2 weeks after giving birth, leaving the infant Catherine to be raised by relatives who viewed her more as a political asset than child. The France into which she would eventually marry was a kingdom on the precipice of religious civil war, where Catholic and Protestant factions were already eyeing each other with the kind of suspicion that breeds massacre, and where the crown's authority was constantly challenged by powerful noble families who saw weakness as opportunity and compromise as betrayal. Catherine's defining character flaw was not mere ambition, but a pathological need to control that manifested as an obsession with preserving Valois dynastic power at any cost. This compulsion, born from her childhood abandonment and reinforced by decades of political marginalization at the French court, where her husband Henry II openly favored his mistress Diane de Poitiers, transformed into a Machiavellian ruthlessness that would define her reign as regent and queen mother. She was a woman who had learned early that power was never given freely, only seized through cunning and held through fear, and this lesson became the governing principle of her political philosophy. Her contemporaries noted her peculiar combination of maternal devotion and calculating coldness, how she could weep genuine tears for her children while simultaneously orchestrating the deaths of their enemies, and how her Italian origins made her perpetually suspect in a French court that never fully accepted her as legitimate. This fundamental insecurity about her place in French society, combined with her absolute determination to see her sons rule successfully, created in Catherine a willingness to employ any method, no matter how brutal, to eliminate threats to Valois supremacy. The fateful decision that would define Catherine's legacy and ultimately lead to her own destruction came in the summer of 1572, when she chose to arrange the marriage of her Catholic daughter Marguerite to the Protestant Henry of Navarre as a gesture of reconciliation between the warring religious factions. On the surface, this appeared to be a diplomatic masterstroke that would bring peace to a kingdom exhausted by a decade of religious warfare, and thousands of Huguenot nobles flocked to Paris for the wedding celebrations, believing that Catherine's initiative represented a genuine desire for coexistence between Catholics and Protestants. However, Catherine's true motivation was far more calculated and dangerous. She had become increasingly alarmed by the growing influence of Admiral Gaspar de Coligny, the Huguenot leader, over her weak-willed son Charles IX, particularly Coligny's plans to involve France in a war against Spain and the Netherlands. This prospect terrified Catherine, who understood that such a conflict would drain the royal treasury, potentially destabilize the monarchy, and remove her from her position as the primary influence over French policy. Her decision to gather the Huguenot leadership in Paris under the pretense of celebration was, in reality, a trap designed to neutralize the Protestant threat once and for all. The descent into horror began with a botched assassination attempt that would spiral into one of the most savage religious massacres in European history. On August 22nd, 1572, just 4 days after the wedding festivities had concluded, an assassin's bullet struck Admiral Coligny as he walked from the Louvre to his lodgings, but succeeded only in wounding him rather than killing him outright. The failed murder attempt, almost certainly ordered by Catherine in consultation with the Guise family and her Italian advisors, created a crisis that threatened to expose the conspiracy and potentially trigger a Huguenot uprising that could sweep the monarchy from power. Catherine found herself trapped between the fury of the Protestant nobles, who suspected royal involvement in the attack, and the Catholic extremists, who demanded immediate action to prevent Huguenot retaliation. The psychological pressure was immense, and contemporary accounts describe Catherine pacing the halls of the Louvre like a caged animal, her normally composed demeanor cracking under the weight of the impossible situation she had created. The wounded Coligny, meanwhile, lay in his bed demanding a royal investigation into the attack, while his fellow Huguenot leaders whispered of revenge and began making preparations to leave Paris, taking with them any hope Catherine might have had of containing the crisis through negotiation or bribery. As panic set in, Catherine made the decision that would transform a failed assassination into a bloodbath that would shock all of Europe and forever stain her reputation. Meeting in secret with her son Henry, Duke of Anjou, Chancellor Biregu, the Duke of Nevers, and the Count of Retz, she authorized what was intended to be the targeted elimination of 50 to 70 Huguenot leaders, convincing the reluctant Charles IX that a preemptive strike was necessary to prevent a Protestant coup that would destroy the monarchy. The plan was meant to be surgical, a calculated political assassination that would decapitate the Huguenot movement without triggering widespread violence. But Catherine had gravely underestimated the depth of Catholic hatred that had been building in Paris for over a decade. When the church bells began tolling at dawn on August 23rd, signaling the beginning of the operation, they unleashed forces that even the most powerful woman in France could not control. The royal guardsmen who burst into Coligny's chamber did not simply kill him. They beat him savagely, threw his mutilated body from the window to the courtyard below, and then dragged his corpse through the streets as Catholic mobs erupted in an orgy of violence that would consume the city for days. The sight of their leader's desecrated remains seemed to drive the Parisian population into a frenzy of religious hatred that transformed Catherine's careful political calculation into an apocalyptic nightmare of sectarian slaughter. The psychological toll of watching her carefully orchestrated plan descend into uncontrollable savagery began to manifest in Catherine's behavior almost immediately, as reports reached the Louvre of atrocities that exceeded even her considerable capacity for ruthlessness. Catholic mobs roamed the streets with lists of Protestant residents, breaking into homes and businesses to drag entire families into the streets, where they were stabbed, beaten, and thrown into the Seine to drown, their bodies bloating in the summer heat as they floated downstream past the palace windows. Women and children were not spared the violence. Pregnant Huguenot women were reportedly disemboweled, their unborn children torn from their wombs and nailed to doors as grotesque trophies, while Protestant infants were seized from their mothers' arms and dashed against walls until their skulls cracked open like eggs. The Seine itself became a river of corpses, clogged with so many bodies that the water turned red and the stench became unbearable even blocks away from the riverbank, while survivors who had managed to escape the initial slaughter found themselves trapped in a city that had become a hunting ground where Catholic citizens competed to see who could devise the most creative methods of torture and execution. Catherine herself was seen walking among the bodies in the courtyard of the Louvre, reportedly inspecting the mutilated remains of Coligny and other Protestant leaders with the cold detachment of a military commander surveying a battlefield. But those close to her noted that something had changed in her demeanor. A hollowness in her eyes that suggested the horror she had unleashed was beginning to consume her from within. The massacre that Catherine had intended to last mere hours instead spread like a plague across France, reaching cities as far away as Lyon, Rouen, and Toulouse, where local Catholic populations, emboldened by news from Paris, began their own campaigns of extermination against Protestant communities. The death toll mounted into the tens of thousands as the violence took on a life of its own, driven by religious hatred, personal vendettas, and simple greed as Catholic citizens seized the opportunity to settle old scores and claim Protestant property for themselves. Reports filtered back to Paris of entire Protestant neighborhoods being burned to the ground, of wells being poisoned with decomposing bodies, and of churches being converted into torture chambers where captured Huguenots were subjected to elaborate forms of mutilation designed to maximize their suffering before death. Catherine found herself issuing increasingly desperate orders to halt the killing, but her commands were ignored by local officials who either sympathized with the violence or were too terrified to intervene, leaving her to watch helplessly as her kingdom tore itself apart in an orgy of religious hatred that she had set in motion but could no longer control. The realization that she had become a prisoner of forces she had unleashed began to manifest in physical symptoms. Courtiers noted that she had developed a persistent cough, that her appetite had disappeared, and that she had begun to suffer from severe headaches that left her confined to her chambers for hours at a time, as if her body was already beginning to rebel against the weight of the atrocities committed in her name. The point of no return came not in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, but in its long-term consequences, which slowly strangled Catherine's political effectiveness and transformed her from the most powerful woman in Europe into an increasingly isolated figure whose authority was undermined by the very violence she had orchestrated. The Protestant community, rather than being destroyed as Catherine had intended, was galvanized by the massacre into a more organized and militant resistance movement that would plague France for the next quarter century, while European Protestant nations reacted with horror and began providing financial and military support to French Huguenots who were now seen as martyrs rather than rebels. More damaging still was the psychological impact on her son, Charles IX, who had initially claimed responsibility for the massacre to protect his mother, but was reportedly haunted by nightmares of the victims and began to suffer from what contemporary observers described as fits of madness, where he would rave about rivers of blood and walls of corpses. The king's declining mental health became a source of constant anxiety for Catherine, who watched her beloved son transform from a malleable puppet into an unstable liability whose unpredictable behavior threatened to expose the conspiracy that had triggered the massacre. When Charles died in 1574, many suspected that Catherine herself had hastened his demise to prevent him from revealing the truth about St. Bartholomew's Day, a rumor that followed her for the rest of her life and contributed to her growing reputation as a poisoner and manipulator who would sacrifice even her own children to protect her secrets. Catherine's gradual loss of control became increasingly apparent during the final decades of her life, as the religious war she had tried to end through massacre instead intensified, and her remaining sons proved even less capable of effective leadership than Charles had been. Henry III, her favorite child and the one in whom she had invested her greatest hopes, was a weak and indecisive ruler who preferred the company of his male favorites to the serious business of governing, leaving Catherine to function as the de facto ruler of France well into her 60s, while watching her life's work slowly crumble around her. The Catholic League, led by the powerful Guise family, had grown increasingly bold in their opposition to royal authority, while the Huguenots had reorganized under Henry of Navarre into a formidable military force that controlled large swaths of southern France and threatened to tear the kingdom apart completely. Catherine found herself trapped between these extremes, attempting to maintain a delicate balance that satisfied neither side, while her own health began to deteriorate under the constant stress of political crisis management and the psychological burden of a massacre she could never fully escape. The chronic cough that had first appeared after St. Bartholomew's Day grew worse with each passing year, developing into a persistent respiratory condition that left her gasping for breath during important meetings and forced her to rely increasingly on written communications rather than personal appearances at court functions. The final catastrophe that sealed Catherine's fate came in December 1588, when her son Henry III, acting without her knowledge or consent, ordered the assassination of Henry, Duke of Guise, and his brother the Cardinal of Guise during a meeting at the Château de Blois. The murders, carried out by the king's personal bodyguards with a brutality that rivaled the worst excesses of St. Bartholomew's Day, represented everything Catherine had tried to avoid throughout her career, a direct confrontation with the Catholic League that would inevitably lead to civil war and the destruction of the monarchy. When Henry III burst into his mother's chambers immediately after the killings to announce what he had done, describing the blood-soaked scene in the chamber above with the enthusiasm of a child showing off a successful hunt, Catherine understood immediately that he had signed his own death warrant and doomed the Valois dynasty to extinction. Her reported response, delivered with the weary resignation of a woman who had watched her life's work destroyed by the very people she had tried to protect, captured the tragic irony of her situation. "Oh, wretched man, what has he done? I see him rushing towards his ruin." The psychological shock of witnessing her son's stupidity, combined with the realization that all her sacrifices and compromises had been rendered meaningless by a single act of royal violence, seemed to drain the life force from Catherine's already weakened body. The final weeks of Catherine de' Medici's life were marked by a physical and spiritual deterioration that reflected the collapse of everything she had worked to build over nearly 3 decades of political dominance. The lung condition that had plagued her for years suddenly worsened dramatically after the Guise murders, as if her body had finally surrendered to the weight of guilt and despair that she had carried since St. Bartholomew's Day, and she found herself struggling to breathe, even during brief conversations with courtiers who increasingly avoided her company. Pleurisy, the inflammation of the membrane surrounding her lungs, filled her chest cavity with fluid that made each breath a conscious effort, creating a drowning sensation that must have reminded her constantly of the Protestant victims she had watched being thrown into the Seine 17 years earlier. The irony was not lost on those who remained loyal to her. The woman who had orchestrated the literal drowning of thousands of heretics was now drowning slowly in the corruption of her own flesh, gasping for air like the Huguenot children who had been held underwater until their lungs filled with the muddy water of the river. As word spread throughout the court that the Queen Mother was dying, the reaction was not grief but indifference, and even relief from those who had grown tired of her manipulations and remembered too clearly the blood she had spilled in pursuit of power. The chronicler Lestoil captured the mood perfectly when he wrote that Catherine had no sooner died than she was treated with as much consideration as a dead goat, a testament to how completely her reputation had been destroyed by the massacre she had authorized. On January 5, 1589, Catherine de' Medici died alone in her chamber at Blois, her final breaths a series of wet, rattling gasps as her lungs filled completely with the fluids that had been slowly drowning her for weeks. The woman who had once commanded kings and shaped the destiny of nations spent her last moments struggling desperately for air, her hands clawing at her throat in a futile attempt to clear the passages that had become clogged with the detritus of her own decay. There was no peaceful slipping away, no dignified final words for posterity. Instead, there was only the grotesque spectacle of a once powerful figure reduced to the level of a dying animal, her body convulsing as it fought against the inevitable while her mind remained cruelly alert to witness every moment of her humiliation. The fluid that filled her chest cavity was tinged with blood and pus, creating a mixture that contemporary physicians described as resembling the polluted water of the Seine during the days immediately following St. Bartholomew's Day, when so many corpses had been thrown into the river that the entire waterway had become a channel of liquid death. In her final delirium, witnesses reported that Catherine seemed to be reaching toward something invisible, her lips moving in what might have been prayers or curses, though no one could make out the words through the liquid sounds that emerged from her throat with each labored exhalation. The immediate aftermath of Catherine's death revealed the complete extent of her political failure and personal isolation, as those who had once courted her favor rushed to distance themselves from her memory and align with new sources of power. Because Paris was controlled by Catherine's enemies in the Catholic League, her body could not be transported to St. Denis for burial with the other queens of France, leaving her to be interred temporarily at Blois like a provincial noble rather than the woman who had ruled the kingdom for nearly 30 years. Even this modest funeral was attended by only a handful of courtiers, most of whom seemed more interested in positioning themselves for the inevitable succession crisis than in paying respects to the deceased, and the ceremony itself was marked by an atmosphere of barely concealed relief that the architect of so much bloodshed had finally been removed from the political equation. The contrast with the elaborate funeral processions that had marked the deaths of her predecessors was stark and deliberate, a public demonstration that Catherine's legacy had been judged and found wanting by those who had lived through the consequences of her actions. Henry III, the son for whom she had sacrificed so much, survived his mother by only 8 months before being assassinated by Jacques Clement, a Dominican friar who justified the murder as necessary to protect the Catholic faith from royal corruption, thus fulfilling Catherine's final prophecy about her son's inevitable destruction and bringing the Valois dynasty to its inglorious end. The long-term consequences of Catherine's choices extended far beyond her own death, reshaping the political and religious landscape of France in ways that would have horrified the woman who had believed herself capable of controlling the forces of history through careful manipulation and strategic violence. The religious wars that she had tried to end through massacre continued for another decade, claiming hundreds of thousands of additional lives and devastating the French economy to such an extent that the kingdom would not fully recover for generations, while the precedent of using mass violence to resolve political disputes established a pattern that would plague French society well into the modern era. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre became a rallying cry for Protestant resistance movements across Europe, inspiring similar conflicts in the Netherlands, Germany, and England, and contributing to the broader breakdown of religious unity that would ultimately fragment Christian Europe into competing national churches and secular political entities. Perhaps most significantly, Catherine's legacy as the Serpent Queen, the foreign poisoner who had corrupted French politics through Italian treachery and Machiavellian cunning, became a template for misogynistic attacks on female political authority that would be deployed against powerful women for centuries to come. From Marie Antoinette to modern political leaders who dare to exercise power in ways that challenge traditional gender roles. The universal lesson embedded in Catherine de' Medici's rise and fall speaks to the fundamental impossibility of maintaining political power through the systematic employment of violence and the inevitable corruption that occurs when the pursuit of dynastic advantage supersedes basic human morality. Her story demonstrates how the abandonment of ethical constraints in pursuit of political goals creates a spiral of escalating brutality that ultimately consumes those who initiated it, transforming them from powerful actors into prisoners of the forces they unleashed and reducing their life's work to a legacy of bloodshed and failure. Catherine's belief that she could control the religious hatred that divided France, manipulating it for her own purposes while avoiding its destructive consequences, reflects a hubris that is both timeless and tragically familiar, echoing through history in the actions of rulers who convince themselves that they can harness chaos without being destroyed by it. The image of this once mighty queen dying alone, drowning in the corruption of her own flesh while being dismissed by her contemporaries as worthy of no more consideration than a dead animal, serves as a powerful reminder that political power is always temporary, that glory always fades, and that the methods we choose in pursuit of our goals ultimately define not only our legacy, but the manner of our destruction. In the end, Catherine de' Medici's greatest achievement was also her greatest failure. She preserved the Valois dynasty long enough to see it die with her favorite son, ensuring that all her sacrifices and all the blood she had spilled would be rendered meaningless by the very violence she had believed would secure her family's future, and that her name would be remembered not as the savior of French monarchy, but as the architect of one of history's most brutal religious massacres.